Changu, Master He's tune. My old home is 1,000 miles away. I've been confined to the palace for 20 years. As I sang the first sad notes of Master He's tune before the emperor, 2 teardrops fell. So we continue with pentasyllabic Chui Chu, and we continue introducing new poets in this anthology. So this is the first appearance of Changu in this book. He has a total of 5 poems here, which puts him pretty squarely in the mid-low range of poets represented in this book. He is a mid-tang poet, and very significantly, his 5 poems put him at 1 more than Yuan Chen, who had 4, and 1 less than Bai Zhuji, who had 6, which, puts him in a pretty high position. And I had never actually heard of him before. This is the first time. This is his first poem, as I said. The other 4, I think, are heptasyllabic quatrains, which means the anthologist definitely thought that Changu excelled in this shorter metric form. So some biographical information about Changu. So he was a native of Qinghai in Beizhou, that is the north of the country, close to modern Beijing. He was probably born around 792, and he first lived in Suzhou and later went to the capital Chang'an. During the first half of the 9th century, he was famous as a poet. Even so, he never passed the examinations for presented scholar. He served in a series of minor posts until he was recommended at court by Lin Huchu, with the support of Bai Zhuji and Du Mu, all supporters of the new faction. Remember, we've talked about previously the early middle years of the 9th century, especially the middle years from the 30s and the 40s to the 50s. The Chinese court was riddled with infighting, and especially with the ruthless opposition of 2 court parties, the new faction and the Li faction. And almost all of the great poets who lived in this period suffered as a consequence of these infightings. So, because he was supported by members of the new faction, he was blocked by Yuan Chen, and he left the capital disappointed, his official career having ended because of this rivalry. Late in life, he lived near Dangyang in a mountain cottage, and he died there around 853. And this is not obvious in this poem that we've read, but it seems that his specialty is landscape poetry. In all those years, landscape and landmark poetry, that in quatrain form, that is, in all those years in which he lived away from the capital, roaming around the country and finally settling in Danyang, he visited many famous landmarks, and he composed poems about the beauty of the scenery and its glorious and interesting legends related to the past. You could say that in this poem there's a streak of the historicist elements in the title to start with, and in the reference to the legend of Master He. So this poem is called Master He's Tune. It apparently is a reference to a pretty obscure legend, at least pretty obscure for me, about a musician, probably a woman. Well, it says Master He, so it must have been a man. So this was a musician that had lived, in theory, during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong, and having crossed him was sentenced to death. As a last wish before his execution, he requested the permission to recite one last song, and that song was so sad that it made everybody cry and everybody sad, and the emperor forgave him. At least he commuted the death sentence for another punishment. And so this is the legend, and it would have been felt perhaps as reactualized by an episode that I think happened at the time of Changu in the court of Emperor Wuzong, where a musician was also, I think, sentenced to death. I think a woman, or a courtier musician or something like that. And she died out of spite reciting Master He's poem. So clearly from the title, we know that we're going to have a lament, and that the tone of the poem is going to be melancholy. Actually, if you've noticed when we read it, the poem is in the voice of a female. It's in the poetic persona is that of a woman, probably a concubine or a servant who has been kept in the imperial palace for a long time, far away from her relatives and living an unfulfilled life. Now, we've encountered a lot of poems about women unhappy in the imperial quarters, but most of them were in the style of the Gungti Shi, of the Jade Terrace style that we mentioned, in which women are generally employed as voyeuristic objects of desire for the male gaze and surrounded by a luxurious environment in the court, which is also the object of desire for the reader of the poem. But this poem is a bit different. Here we do not get this languishing belle surrounded by precious objects, sighing, filled with ennui and tristesse in the imperial palace. Here we get a woman directly voicing her complaints and making somebody cry. It's not clear who is crying at the end of the poem, but, you know, she is sad, she's telling her tale, she's singing this sad song, and she's making people sad. So the topic of it would be uprootedness, being far from one's roots, the sad life of service, instead of the typical, like the man in a man's persona, the sadness of spending a lot of years serving in the frontier. This is the sadness of a woman serving in the court and far from relatives. And it's a short poem. I wouldn't say there are other sub-themes to this poem except that. There's this element of the woman in the palace that's unhappy, and there is this literary reference to Master Heston. So let's take a look at it couplet by couplet as usual. One interesting thing in this poem, noticeable even in the translation, is that each line is correlated with a number, which creates a certain rhythm or parallelism in numbers. Like 1,000 in the first line, 20 in the second, 1 in the third, 2 in the last one. First couplet. My old home is 1,000 miles away. I've been confined to the palace for 20 years. So the first couplet really gives us the background of this person. It doesn't seem to connect very explicitly with the title, Master Heston. We might imagine, while we're still reading this couplet, that perhaps it's Master Hen who is speaking. But, you know, the only thing we know in the first couplet is that the speaker, he or she, has lived in the court for a long time, probably serving in it, and is not too happy about it. And that person is also from far away. So we get time and place. So time and space. So a long distance in space from her family and a long distance in time from her family. So this is an uprooted person. And remember what we've mentioned in, you know, poem after poem. This is typical of scholar officials, but it affects all Chinese people of this era. The strong beliefs in family and in local connections with the family, and, you know, the hierarchical but also close and protective nature of an extended family. These were very important things for the Chinese of this period. And being away from the family, even for a good cause like serving the emperor or being, you know, at the imperial palace, it always had this bittersweet element of being severed from one's roots. So this person is a victim in some way or other, or at least feels herself to be a victim. She's been in the court for a long time, and probably with little advancement, because otherwise she would have reasons for being a little bit happier. And she's very far away from her relatives. Presumably she hadn't been able to see them. Second couplet. As I sang the first sad notes of Master Hei's tune, before the emperor, 2 teardrops fell. So, reflecting upon this sad, sad parting in time and space from her relatives, she sings. She is singing in the court. Maybe she has been told to sing, or maybe, you know, she just felt in the mood and decided to sing. And of course she chooses Master Hei's tune, which is a sad, brooding, melancholy song about bitterness and unhappiness and that sort of thing. She sings. We don't know even if she sings the whole poem. Just with the first sad notes, there is an effect. Before the emperor, 2 teardrops fell. Who cried? Maybe the emperor was moved by her song. Maybe she was moved by the song she was singing. Maybe other people, a courtier or a listener, cried. But, you know, there was the effect. And this connects us with a very traditional topic in Chinese poetry, especially in the reflection, on the literary reflection of poetry, what it's for, what it means. The classics, I think it was the Mao commentary to the Book of Odes, but also some texts in prose, or probably the Analects or the Shujing, they already transmit the idea that poetry expresses intention. So there's this romantic attitude in Chinese early literary theory that poetry must express feelings, or more than feelings, intentions, which can be political. In fact, the political ones are the ones that are lionized by the classical Confucian tradition and by the scholar officials, who use poetry as basically a means of indirect criticism of the emperor. That is, through a poem, you can tell something to your superior indirectly without necessarily offending them. So poetry serves a political function, both by scholar officials giving advice to the emperor, also by collecting poems from the people. You would be gauging, popular poetry, the feelings of the people towards the administration. So it's another way of using poetry to measure the government. This view of poetry as expressing feelings, as expressing intentions, can also be extended into a romantic mode, into poetry moving someone, moving the feelings, not only the political intentions, but other sort of more romantic, more emotive feelings. And I think this is well represented in this ending. Yeah? The poem is made, and the effect is immediately felt by some elements of the audience, at least one, who cries at the sad story of this woman. So, pretty simple poem, but on a moving theme and a variation of what we've encountered of both women in the palace and of men in the frontier complaining. In this case, it's a woman in the palace complaining.